The universities of Tokyo and Leiden have together recently established a new rotating chair in honor of Professor Hisashi Owada. Professor Owada has been a judge and president of the International Court of Justice in The Hague and an honorary professor at Leiden University on the topic of European-Japanese relations. The chair, which will alternate between Leiden and the University of Tokyo, will be specifically focused on geopolitics and international law. With significant international transformation processes taking place today, these topics are highly relevant. We are very honored that today Professor Owada himself and the first holder of the Owada Chair, Professor Dominique Moïsi, are here with us today to share some of their ideas. And I would like to ask them a first question. And I would like to start with Professor Owada. So what do you see as the most significant challenges in international affairs presently?
Thank you, Professor Duyvesteyn, for your kind invitation. I'm very much honored to have the chair established at Leiden together with Tokyo University after my name. And I'm very pleased to have this undertaking as a joint collaboration between the two universities, one from East and one from the West. I would like to congratulate Dominique Moïsi, a very old good friend of mine, who has accepted to be the first speaker of this chair at the inaugural address this coming October. Now, let me jump into the subject matter. Indeed, I would agree that with many of you that today we are faced with a very grave situation in the whole international system. My personal view is that this comes basically from the aftermath of the Cold War. I do not think the Cold War itself is such a major historical event. It is perhaps one phase of history, but the way it was interpreted was something wrong in my mind to create the present situation, partly because of the different ways of interpreting what has happened. When the Cold War ended, they hailed it as the victory of Western democracy and the capitalist system and all those values that the West has been upholding and defending. In a sense, that is true. On the other hand, my own view is that the Cold War ended not primarily because of the victory of the West in ideological terms, but rather the self-defeat that the Soviet Union has invited to itself by failing to meet the demands of the globalized world, the whole situation. And as a result, some thought that this was going to be there was a famous international lawyer who said that now the international the divided world based on the divided international law is gone. I don't think that is accurate. And of course, there was some savant in the United States who even said that, predicted that the end of history is forthcoming, meaning in the sense of a dialectic logic of Hegel, which means that finally the dialectic evolution of history is terminated. I think that's much too optimistic, and the event which has followed shows this to be untrue. Now, the reason why I think that this is a major event is that it created minds of the people that the world is now free from conflicting interests, conflicting national interests, and the struggle for mastery, and all these things which prevailed in the earlier world. That is not the case. And the other problem is that the end of the Cold War paradoxically unleashed forces which had been latent but contained in the Cold War confrontation, as the famous expression MAD policy, mutual assured destruction policy, has demonstrated. Now that framework is gone, I think states started to pursue their parochial interests according to their own perceived national interests, and they forgot about the need to maintain the minimum public order of the international community. At the same time, there is a trend which has nothing to do with the termination of the Cold War, or rather indirectly connected with that, and that is the change which has come about in the world in the meantime, which are the globalization of the world, which moves things in a different way. And therefore, I'm not really putting my conclusion first, but in relation with the third question that you're going to ask, what will be the future? I'm very optimistic in the long-term future, but in the meantime, in the short-term perspective, one has to be very careful in trying to contain this disruption of the world order, which we can do if we succeed in creating some kind of a consensus. If consensus is not possible, at least a coalition of the willing to contain this situation. As an international lawyer, I regret that, because from international point of view, international law point of view, the world should prevail where international legal framework, international legal order created by the prevalence of international law should be the rule of the game. But that rule sometimes seems to be either ignored or disregarded. And I think it's important to try to push this aspect of the situation, namely the relevance of international law in terms of maintaining minimum international public order in a global society is going to be highly important. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that highly stimulating answer. I think you stressed the significance of the end of the Cold War as a major rupture in international affairs, but you also stressed the continuity in terms of the importance of interest and national interests. Professor Moïsi, how do you see these changes? What do you see as the most significant challenge in international affairs?
Well, I think I would give the same answer than Professor Owada, but with different terms. I think the most crucial challenge today is to reconcile the modern agenda of geopolitics, i.e. the need for a new multilateralism to confront climate change, the risk on biodiversity, with the classical challenges of international relation, i.e. balance of power politics. How can you create a world that is at the same time multilateral? Because we all face the same planetary challenges, and at the same time accept the new reality of the international system, which is to a large extent a new bipolar order, with the Soviet Union being replaced by a much more potent, powerful, in a way legitimate actor than the Soviet Union was yesterday, i.e. China. How do you balance these two important considerations? The need to be together against climate change, whereas at the same time, there is a conflict of power, of interest, and of value between the United States and China. That is, I would say, in my mind, the most important challenge we are facing. And I would probably stop here, thinking that we've said more or less the same thing in different manners.
Thank you very much. I am quite struck by the fact that both of you are rather optimistic, in the sense that a rules-based order has a future, that multilateralism has a future, that there is an urgent need to cooperate, to work together in order to tackle the climate crisis, global threat to biodiversity, as you said. But there is also a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges that we are faced with that give people a sense of negative developments in international affairs. And one such thing is the rise of geopolitical thinking. So thinking in terms of a zero-sum game, what one party loses is a gain for another party. And my second question would be, are we still well-versed enough to think along geopolitical lines? Are Western states, including Japan, still versed enough to use geopolitical logics in a post-territorial and globalized interconnected world? How do you view these things, Professor Owada?
Thank you, Isabelle. That's a pertinent question. I think that I don't know whether I understood you correctly, but if you mean that the logic of geopolitics should be more strongly practiced by the countries you described as Western Europe and Japan and so forth, if that is what you mean, I'm not quite sure whether that is the approach we should pursue, because I accept that the power is an extremely important factor in international relations. Even international law has to recognize that power is a factor which has to be taken into account. You know that in the interwar period, when people like Morgenthau and Hans Kelsen and even Schmidt, who became the political scientist for Nazi Germany, all agreed that the Weimar Republic was a failure because it was too utopian in its approach and in its practice. And therefore, as a result, they divided their roots. Kelsen went into the pure theory of law, meaning that what international law is trying to get at is a framework where things should be. If the reality of the world is not in conformity with that, that is a fault of the reality. That is not what the international law is responsible for. And this pure theory approach, logical as it was, and nice it would have been, was not a tool to explain the reality and to cope with the reality. Whereas people like Morgenthau decided to quit the place, and he went into the theorist of international relations, as you all know. Now, his end result was to emphasize the importance of power politics, to use your language, the geopolitics element. Now, I don't deny that political power is an important factor. On the other hand, to think that the whole world is moving along the line, along the logic of power politics is equally wrong, in the sense that the world has become much more complex as compared with the world of 19th century or even the interwar period. When power is defined in terms of the military power, it is only one segment, an important segment, but nevertheless one segment of the factor. It involves the economic power, it involves technological power, it even includes cultural power. Now, all these things are in play in dealing with international affairs among conflict between nations. And that is why I think that I mean, it depends very much upon the definition, but the word geopolitics, including the word geo, means that it is a remnant of the 19th century thinking, where the issue was primarily territorial and the geo factor was an important factor. But nowadays, power, important as it is only part of the whole group of different types of power. And I think that you have to take that factor into account. And if you try to cope with that situation by power in the same sense, in the physical sense or in the naked sense, then I think the conflict will grow, and I think it's going to be a dangerous road for us to follow. On the other hand, if we succeed in creating a broader consensus, not consensus necessarily consensus, a majority of countries which adhere to the same framework, which you might call the liberal internationalism, which used to develop since the end of the Second World War, is going to be maintained, then that is why I'm more optimistic about the long-term future. Although in short terms, this is not going to be an easy road to tread, and we have to utmost to do two things. One is to try to contain the conflict into bursting out, as it has been the case in the Middle East, for example. On the other hand, it is also important to try to maintain our stance in terms of creating the common values, creating the system of sharing the common values like human dignity. Whether it crystallizes in the concrete form of human rights is a different matter. But I think the basic fact of human dignity is an essential characteristic of any society, whether national or international or whatever grouping. That is an undeniable fact. And I think the humankind has been wise enough to recognize through the years of experience where tragedies have happened because of this issue, human rights issue. And I think that in this globalized world, this humanization of the world system is growing very fast and expanding. And all these things would favor the way that I have been advocating, that it is important to try to promote that while avoiding the unnecessary conflicts in the physical sense, so that the world will be more in line with the possibly emerging consensus, which had been growing since the 19th century, and particularly in the second half of the 20th century, namely to have the global community consisting of human beings, and the promotion of whose welfare and whose safety is going to be the first item on the agenda. And in that sense, it is in that sense that why I am more optimistic. And while, as I said at the beginning, I do not deny that power is an important factor that we have always to take into account. To try to play the game on the basis of power politics is not the right way to proceed. That's how I feel. Perhaps,
thank you. I want to clarify just a little bit. It's very clear what you're saying, and I, in essence, completely agree with it. But what I was trying to get at was the potential development that the major powers in the international system are operating based on different frames of reference. Mm-hmm. And that is a risky affair for international affairs, because if you don't use the same language anymore, if you have a diverging set of values, then you might be able to talk about human dignity and you might be able to talk about international law. But if the perspective, the other participants in this game, if they don't share the basic rules, then you run a huge risk. That is what I wanted to bring to the table.
Thank you very much for your explanation. I don't want to deprive Dominique of his time, and so I shall be very, very brief, but I just want to comment so that there would be no misunderstanding. I totally agree with you. But the point I wanted to make is that whereas the Cold War confrontation was a confrontation about how the global rule of governance should be, there are the different approaches to it. The situation in the present day world, like the position of Russia represented by Putin, or even the position represented by Xi of China, not to speak about the position of Donald Trump of the United States. I don't think that is really the same situation as a kind of confrontation. That's why I said in my earlier intervention that some people lamented the fact that we were living in a divided world based on divided international law. Namely, this was two different worlds, and coexistence in the proper sense of the word was impossible. The coexistence, as advocated during the Cold War time, was an interim arrangement in order to bring about peace or temporary peace. Whereas now, I think it's more to do with the different elements. In the case of President Putin, it's more the sentiment or the emotion of revanchism or irredentism, so to speak. And in the case of President Xi of China, this was based primarily because of the long years of humiliation that China has suffered. That's also another aspect of emotions affecting the international scene. Now, in the case of the United States, this was an aberration. I don't think what Donald Trump was representing as president was a proper representation of the feelings in general of the United States. So all these specific factors are affecting the present scene. And I think that it is possible to agree on a common language in this situation, hopefully. Although, of course, it's more difficult in the case of China than with any other country because of the fact that it is not simply the reaction to the past humiliation, but also the fact that China has always been thinking about itself as the center of the world, and the concept of the central kingdom of the world is the basis of the Chinese name, Chukaminkoku, the flowering kingdom of China. So this could develop into something which would be tantamount to confrontation in the more proper intrinsic sense of the word. But I do not think that time has come. People talk about the conflict between the United States and China, but there are different dimensions. One is the dimension of rivalry in economic terms, for example. Another is the desire to seek for hegemony or not to be replaced in its hegemonic power in the case of political powers between the United States and China. The third is this element which we should be careful about. That is the process of how the world order should be. What are the bases? What are the values to be incorporated into that equation? Now, this is something which has to be tested. But my understanding of Chinese classics and the history of China does not indicate that is the way which China should proceed in spite of its own name of the country. And I think that we can certainly work out a dialogue on this matter to try to frame a minimum public order of international community on that basis. That's what I was trying to say. I'm not really saying something very different from what you have said. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's hear from Professor Moïsi.
Well, I think first, geopolitics is a lesson in complexity. Understanding the complexity of the world means facing the world with modesty. And I have in my own professional life emphasized the emotional dimension of geopolitics. And Professor Owada, speaking about China, mentioned the word humiliation. That is, I think, a key word to understand the situation as it has evolved since the end of the Cold War. Russian humiliation, Chinese humiliation, returning with a vengeance to the forefront of their policies as they feel, in particular in the case of China, that time may be playing in their favor. But I think there is another dimension I would emphasize. Professor Owada mentioned a lot Europe of the 19th century. I would go further down in historical terms and look at the year 1648, the year when the Peace of Westphalia was signed. In 1648, Europe came out from a 30 years war that had been terrible in its demographic human consequences. And no one managed to prevail. There were various actors who wanted to dominate Europe. Habsburg of Spain initially, the French kings, at some time the Dutch Republic were a key and very ambitious actor together with Great Britain. But everybody failed in its attempt to dominate Europe, and they had to come to a compromise. And to a large extent, I would say that today we would need a new kind of Westphalian peace, but enlarged to the world in geographic terms and enlarged to many topics in content terms, something that would regroup what I described in my first intervention as the new agenda of world politics and the old agenda of world politics. All of this to say that in the present world, we have to be aware of two dangers, two fallacies. The first one is to be naive, is to pretend we can live in a post-power world. The second is to be simplistic and to believe, like maybe Putin, Erdogan, or Xi Jinping seem to believe today, that power can prevail, and power in the harshest sense of the terms. I think we've seen in the past century the limits of power and the cost of power politics for our system. Can we come to a common table to manage to combine in a new kind of Westphalian peace meeting the new agenda and the old agenda of world politics? This is, to my mind, the real challenge, the real test. And from that point of view, I think geopolitics is crucial to manage the new reality and the old reality. And I would end up with one word, that is the word complexity. That is, in my mind, what is geopolitics? A lesson in complexity.
Thank you very much. I think your two contributions shared a large emphasis on history. And I can completely relate. I am a professor of global history. We can learn a lot from history. And I very much am triggered by the image that you paint of calling for a new Westphalian peace, a new Westphalian conference in which all the participants think and share ideas about shaping the international order. And this is the bridge towards my last question, which focuses on international law in particular, which is very close to the heart of Professor Owada. We have come a long way when it comes to building an international order founded on legal principles and mutual respect. How do you see the future of this international legal order, this international rules-based order, when some of the states are seen as no longer subscribing to some of these core principles that form the building blocks? Professor Owada.
Thank you. I would like to reiterate what I said earlier. Part of my statement to answer to your question is what I stated earlier, that in the longer term perspective, I think the historical tradition of the development of international law will continue in spite of the vicissitudes which it has to suffer, sometimes up and sometimes down. But I think the general trend is there, partly because people have come to believe that that is the right way to proceed. Human beings in that sense are becoming wiser with years, and historical lessons would teach us the lesson how to proceed. So it's a long-term perspective. Having said that, in a short-term perspective, I totally agree with what Dominique has said. He spoke about the Peace of Westphalia, which is exactly what I think about the Peace of Westphalia. the international law in the traditional sense, at least up to the 19th century or the beginning of the first half of the 20th century, has been primarily the product of the Western countries. When Japan joined the law community of nations in the second half of the 19th century, we had to suffer a lot, although Japan fortunately was not colonized. But we had to learn a lot about what it means to get into the community of nations. Because the community of nations at that time was called the community of civilized nations, which is accurate. But community of civilized nation is an extension of community of Christian countries. Whether it's a democracy or not, it was the basic criterion was the Christian countries. There was a big debate among international lawyers in the 19th century where the non-Christian countries should be part of the community of nations. And the exception admitted at that time were Turkey, Ottoman Empire, and Japan. There was a big debate, a big controversy among international lawyers of that day. We have come a long way since that time. But up to the end of the Second World War, when the decolonization started and the self-determination became one of the practiced principles, not just the words, but in principle. Then, of course, there was a question of participation of those newly born countries from Africa, from Asia, and sometimes from Latin America in the proper sense of the word. And I think the important point is that now international law is becoming more universal in its creation and in its application and in its execution. And that is going to be an extremely important factor to create the kind of world that Dominique was talking about as a new Westphalian conference, or the situation emerging after that type of consensus building efforts. And I think that if you look at countries in Asia and in Africa, you will see that if you take the International Court of Justice, the practice of International Court of Justice, there are many more countries with a dispute among themselves to bring before the International Court of Justice and to try to settle their disputes in accordance with international law. Namely, the rule-based society, just not in words, but also in practice, is coming along. And I think that that is the basis on which the world has to proceed in order to create, in order to consolidate what I describe as the minimum international public order. And in that sense, of course, some of the aspects of some major countries in relation with the international arbitration is a very lamentable fact. But I think that that's also part of the picture in which we have to do our best efforts to try to bring the world into a safer and more justified world. Thank you.
Professor Moïsi, the future of a rules-based international order.
Well, I'm much less competent on the topic than Hisashi is, but I would give my own answer. The first thing is that nothing is more dangerous than people who speak of law, describe themselves as the universal norm, and don't practice at home what they teach abroad. And that has been the case of the United States, especially, of course, under the Trump administration, but even before. I think you have to also to distinguish between the universal Western norm, i.e. democracy, and the needs of the international system. I would say that the international system needs two things. The first one is a sincere and real emphasis on human rights. You cannot accept the absolute disinterest for human rights that is clearly practiced in some parts of the world. And the second is the rule of law. You can live without democracy, but in the long run, you cannot live properly without the rule of law. The people that are in charge must have a sense of the collective good. If not, they are going to fail, and they are going to lead the world in the worst possible direction. And this is where you have to integrate the word values. And this is where, to a large extent, Japan is part of our collective culture. If you look at Japan in terms of culture, it is possibly the most exotic of all Asian countries, the one that is the furthest away from our way of thinking. But if you switch from culture to political culture, well, Japan is the Asian West, much closer to us than any other Asian country. Maybe France feels closer in its sense of power from China than from Japan. But I think by the end of the day, it is a mistake. The country we have closed political culture values. The country we have the closest political value alliance with in Asia is clearly Japan. And we must cherish, cultivate that dimension for the Japanese and for us.
I don't think I could have worded it any better in terms of arguing for the necessity to establish this chair in honor of Professor Owada. Let me thank you both for your contributions. I want to give you one last opportunity maybe to share some words of wisdom by way of closing. Professor Owada.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo Professor Duyvesteyn for what you have just said. I think one of the significant elements of this chair is that it is going to be a place for a forum for dialogue between, not just between the two universities, but between the two cultures. The culture that Leiden University represents, and the culture, the values that the culture that University of Tokyo represents, namely by putting in the elements from the perspective of Western European culture or cultural tradition, and compare it with the cultural dimension of what we have been living with in East Asia, is going to be an extremely fruitful and useful exercise of this chair. So I congratulate Leiden University on what you have undertaken. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Moïsi, any last words of wisdom to share?
Well, I just want to end by saying, oh, deeply honored I am to be the first holder of the Owada Chair. Professor Owada, Ambassador Owada, has been, in my eyes, the incarnation of the best Japan can offer to the world. And he has been a bridge, an ideal bridge between Japan and the world. So again, I could not repeat enough how deeply pleased and honored I am to be the first holder of the chair honoring the person of Hisashi Owada.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here with us today to share your ideas about the developing international order and also the challenges that we are facing today. We are very much looking forward to welcome both of you at the inaugural event in October, when we officially launch the Owada Chair in honor of Professor Owada. So thank you very much for being here today, and see you in a couple of months.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle.